From 1997 to 1999, my wife and I were in Berrien Springs, Michigan at the seminary at Andrews University. I was going there, as have thousands of other pastors from around the world, to get my Master's of Divinity. I didn't know what to expect when I went there, but I was pleasantly surprised that while I wasn't that keen on getting back into doing homework, I nonetheless was being exposed to some ideas that I thought were just amazing. Many of them you have heard me talk about, particularly with regard to what Adventism used to be. Adventism used to be a apostolic-led church planting movement. We did not have settled pastors, as you've heard me talk about on many occasions. Instead, we had ministers that were paid to travel about, much as the Apostle Paul must have, and plant churches. They would go to an unentered area. They would spend anywhere from 6 months to 2 or 3 years, perhaps, at the most, and they would establish a church. They'd hold a series of meetings. They would establish leadership in that church, and then they would move on to the next place. It was much like the New Testament, and that's exactly why the early Adventist church did it. Well, when I'm at seminary listening to these things, I'd never heard this before. To me, it was absolutely astonishing that we used to be that way, and that we used to be, according to one of my professors' research, the fastest growing Protestant movement that the world had ever seen. We were growing like wildfire. People were coming to the Adventist church not merely to listen to the message, but other churches were coming to the Adventist church to answer the question, how is it that you are growing so fast and we are not? Well, in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, that changed dramatically, as you've heard me talk about before. We got settled pastors, things changed. Lay people became far less active than they were previously as pastors took over the leadership of churches, and our growth rate dropped dramatically. Well, as I'm sitting there in class at the seminary, I'm thinking about this, and I can just feel this boiling inside of me, thinking, I must do this. I must do this. But God, how? How could it be done? You see, currently the way that the Adventist church is structured, and I'm not saying this is done intentionally, I'm just saying that momentum over the years has not necessarily served us well. I knew that going back to the conference that I would be going to, this is out in the Washington Conference, Western Washington State, like almost every other conference in North America, here's what I would find. There would not be structural support to plant a church. There would not be enthusiastic support amongst administration, not because they were opposed to growth, but because church planting was so foreign. It would be like walking in and saying, here's a set of tweezers, now go mow your lawn. Okay, I mean, who does that? Nobody does it. It seems impossible unless you knew that your tweezers were like 20 feet wide and in 10 minutes you'd be done. I mean, things change, right? But that was the mindset I was going back to, and so I thought, I had this burning passion inside that I believe God had placed there to plant a church. I called my administration, and I said, yeah, I'm coming back. Any idea where you're going to put me? I said, well, we thought about this, we thought about here, we're not sure yet. And I said, would it be possible that I could plant a church? Well, I don't know if we've really got a place for that to happen. And I'm thinking there's like 1 million people that don't know their ear from a donut when it comes to picking up a Bible. I mean, how could you possibly not have a place to plant a church, right? And finally, they came down to it. I was like a week or two out, and they said, well, we have an assignment for you. Yes, what is it? I said, we're going to send you to, and they told me that they were going to send me to Everett, to the Forest Park Church there. And my heart just dropped to the floor. They're already established. They've already got, they don't need a planter there. And I asked about it. I said, well, what about church plant? They said, well, this is where we're putting you for the time being. With my heart heavy, we moved to Everett and began the work there. Wonderful people. A church of about 200 people or so that were attending there, 200, 225. And good people, nice people, resourceful people, faithful people, and I just didn't see any sign of possibilities to plant a church. And I managed to keep my mouth shut for about 3 months. And then I just couldn't do it anymore. And I thought to myself, either I need to plant or I need to move to a place where I can. And I thought, well, let's see, maybe these people will go with me. Maybe they'll plant. Maybe we can plant something from here. And so I called a meeting of the elders. If I recall correctly, there were 6 of them. And called called these elders. I said, I have a proposal, and would you meet me in my office on such and such a night at such and such a time? And I want to share this with you and see what you think. And I'm thinking to myself, this is make or break, you know. Either they say yes or I'm moving on type of thing. I didn't tell them that. So we get to the meeting, and I spend over an hour going through Adventist history. Started with the New Testament, actually, and go through how we used to operate as a church, and then get to early Adventism and how we modeled ourselves after what God had done in the New Testament, and how the result was this explosive growth and people meeting Jesus by the thousands and becoming an international movement, you know, this incredible, you know, firestorm of the gospel moving across the globe. And then I said, here in the northern end of the greater Seattle metro area, I think that we could plant a church. And I laid out the bare bones of what I thought might be a decent proposal. And I finished, and I said, so, what do you think? Now, you're going to have to forgive my young eyes and my prejudice in my youth at this time. Because one of the elders there was a lady of many years. And I thought, if I'm going to get pushback, it's going to be her. She was the first to speak. She said, we have been praying that God would send someone here who would help us to do this. And they all said the same thing. I had no idea. I had no idea that there was any enthusiasm whatsoever for church planting. But long before I set foot on that church campus, God had been preparing the way for this planting effort to happen. Long story short, we began to gear up to plant a church. Ultimately, we took 12 people as a core team. If I was going to do it again, I would have taken a few more. They would tell you the same thing if they were standing here. It was the most and remains the most difficult thing that I've ever done in ministry. It was intense. We started in an area called Lake Stevens. It was about only 15, 20 minutes away from the church, but when you're in a large metro area, you get to a whole different population just with that short of a drive. And so we planted a church over there. It was kind of an affluent, upper crust community. We started with 12 people. When I left 2.5 years later, we were averaging 75 on a Sabbath, none of which had been going to any church of any kind prior to coming to our church. It was an unbelievable thing. I learned a tremendous amount, and we were able to be a light for the three angels' messages and Jesus Christ and his gospel in that community where there had not been any before. I tell you this story because anytime a church attempts to do something new, the questions always come. How would that work? How could that be possible? I mean, look, we've been established in this community, but we don't know much about Woodstock, for instance. We don't know much about the people. We know some, but we don't know much. How could it happen? Doesn't it seem like too much of a stretch? Wouldn't it be taking resources perhaps from here that we need, that would go there, that we actually need to be here? And the questions keep going around. So here's what I would like you to do. As we think about whenever it is that business meeting is going to take place, when we make the decision, should we plant or should we not? When we take that vote, my prayer for us is that we will have spent time in prayer asking God, Lord, how have you prepared the way for us? How have you prepared? What is it, Lord, that we need to be looking for? If you had asked me prior to that elders meeting at the Forest Park Church, is there any preparation that the Lord has made to plant a church in this area? I would have said emphatically no. I didn't see a thing. But unbeknownst to me, the Lord got there long before I ever knew that there even was a Forest Park Church. Could it be that God is doing the same thing? There are many, many thousands of people in this valley that are not yet ready for Jesus to come. Wouldn't it be amazing if we were to discover that God has prepared the way for us to plant a new light in a new place?